like to announce Iva Pesa, who did research. She is a postdoc in our Center for Frugal Innovations in Africa, and she did last year research on frugal innovations in Zambia, and she's going to tell us all about that. Okay, I would say the floor is to Iva.
Thank you, Kees. It'll be a bit hard to beat the interactive session we just had now, but I hope you'll also be happy with this topic that I'll be talking about cooking, about cook stoves and sawdust pellets. And improved cook stoves have received a lot of attention in the last couple of years. And I argue that these improved cook stoves and the sawdust pellets are a frugal innovation, which has taken off to a certain extent because it's created somewhat viable businesses, but it's not meeting its kind of full potential that the entrepreneurs wished that it would be meeting up until now. So I want to investigate why it's not reaching the kind of mass scale that the entrepreneurs are envisaging. And therefore, we have to look into the puzzle of non-adoption, which is a bit more challenging than it might look on the first glance. But first, I wanted to give you quotes of one of the companies that are selling these cook stoves. And it talks about the narrative of kind of transformation and change that they want to bring about. So Emerging Cooking Solutions is a private company that sells clean cook stoves and sustainable fuel pellets. ECS aims to help Zambia's population, who mainly use smoky charcoal stoves, switch over to cleaner cooking methods. ECS produces sustainable fuel by pelletizing forest waste, sawdust in this case, into renewable biofuel. The switch from charcoal to renewable biofuel will reduce deforestation and improve living conditions by limiting the negative health effects of smoke produced from charcoal stoves. ECS targets low-income people in urban areas who rely heavily on charcoal for cooking. Urban populations have the incentive to switch from charcoal to sustainable fuel pellets because fuel pellets are much cheaper. So I argue that kind of in this excerpt, you see a lot of elements of frugal innovations, and I'll be going through them because in theory companies like Emerging Cooking Solutions would seem to be doing everything right, but still they're not kind of finding their mass market. And yeah, I think we should question why that is. So just a map of Zambia. It's a country in southern towards Central Africa, and the area where I did my case study is Kitwe, here on the Copperbelt. It's a very urbanized area, and it's been so since the 1930s. And a lot of people there cook using charcoal. Some of them cook using electricity. But in a lot of areas of the city, charcoal is still very dominant. And that's the place where I did my fieldwork from September until November last year. And it's also where Emerging Cooking Solutions has set up their factory to pelletize the sawdust. So this is kind of a graphic image of cooking on charcoal and how it looks. Charcoal trade on bicycles and women cooking in Shima at the bottom. So cooking, as we saw on the last slide, in urban Kitwe is dominated by charcoal and simple mbaula stoves. These are stoves that can be produced for about $3 to $4, made from iron and sometimes waste materials. And as we will see, in 2008, a Zambian entrepreneur came up with the idea to convert sawdust into cooking energy. And you might think, why sawdust? That's because in the 1960s on the Zambian Copperbelt, large plantations, tree plantations of pine and eucalyptus trees were planted to support the mining industry. sometimes not directly the mining industry, but then also the carpentry industries and all other things that came up with that. And if you process these trees, you get a lot of sawdust. As you see on this slide, this is kind of a dramatic mountain of sawdust. And this sawdust doesn't have a lot of other uses. You can use it for several things, but at present, it's just kind of piling up. So this entrepreneur came up with the idea to make pellets from this sawdust. The entrepreneur is Mr. Sontakauti. He had a bit of a forestry background, working for all kinds of sustainable energy enterprises. And he somehow ended up in Burkina Faso, where they showed him that by using an empty paint tin and filling it with sawdust, you can create kind of cooking energy, and that sparked the idea to start doing something with that. And he was linked to the Swedish Development Agency and the Swedish Embassy, and they invited him to Sweden, because in Sweden, apparently, there's a lot of knowledge about pelletizing and using pellets as cooking fuel. So if we look at the polycentric aspect of frugal innovation, you already see it here by linking Zambian and Swedish entrepreneurs and ideas across continents. They started experimenting with this pelletizing technology in a factory in Kitwe. And they decided to set up in Kitwe because that's where most of the sawdust is. And you have a lot of, a big concentration of urban population which can function as a viable market. So in 2011, after experimenting with some other types of fuels and experimenting how the humidity content of the pellets should be and all these kinds of things, they came up with a viable and functioning sawdust pellet. But then they still had to search for a suitable microgasifying stove to, to combust these pellets in, to use them in. They searched for lots of different types of stoves, but eventually they settled on the Philips stove manufactured in Lesotho. And this was because they found that the Philips stove was the most efficient one. The downside of the Philips stove is that it costs almost $100, which is very expensive if you compare it to the $3 or $4 that the Mbaula costs. But they said that the payback costs of using the pellets and the cost saving from the pellets, because they're cheaper than charcoal, would pay that back eventually, but still the cost is very high to bear. But in any case, in 2012, Emerging Cooking Solutions was born in Zambia as a company in which 2 Swedish entrepreneurs collaborated with the Zambian entrepreneur Sontakauti, whom you see kind of blurry here. And that's the machine that produces the pellets. And these are the pellets. They look kind of like, almost like rabbit feed, the small pellets. Not everybody knows what they are, but just small things. So if we look at this very short story, this very short overview of the history of emerging cooking solutions, we see that it's kind of polycentric. They aim to produce a low-cost good, at least in terms of the pellets, because it's a waste material converted into cooking fuel, so it's cheaper than charcoal. And the design was quite user-centric because they involved a lot of people in which stove to adopt, how to manufacture the pellets, and so on. So their business model. When they first started selling the Philips stoves in quite kind of low-income community in Kitwe, they sold them at subsidized rates, from 700 kwacha down to 250 kwacha. And their rationale for that was that the pellet sales would make up for this subsidy, that they would earn so much from pellets that the subsidy wouldn't really matter anymore. Now, after 2.5 years, they found out that this wasn't really the case, but that's kind of been their driving ideology, at least. So they wanted to target low-income areas, and they had actually quite a lot of difficulty finding resellers. They didn't want to take on all the marketing themselves, but they wanted to have people in local markets to sell the pellets for them so that they could just supply a bulk supply to the resellers and that the resellers would take care of the distribution. This proved to be more difficult than they envisaged. They also engaged in marketing through church and women's groups. And yeah, they found really this marketing aspect to be much more labor intensive than they had first envisaged. Because people really had to be educated about the idea of using AMP pellets and the new stoves, both of which were quite different from methods in which people had been cooking so far. In the compound of St. Anthony's, they sold more than 100 stoves, which doesn't sound maybe as a lot, but in this quite small compound of Kitwe, it was a significant amount. And I think in all, until now in Zambia, they've sold about 2,500 stoves. But the problem is that even if people do buy the stoves, they don't continue to buy the pellets, which to me is a bit paradoxical, because even if you invest 250 kwacha into buying the stove, why won't you continue to buy the pellets? And that's kind of what I wanted to find out. So this is what it looks like to cook on these Philips stoves. These are the pellets up close. These are the prime stoves, which are slightly cheaper, a small one and a big one. But Emerging Cooking Solutions decided not to go for the prime stove, but to adopt the Philips stove, which is a lot more expensive. So Emerging Cooking Solutions argues that they offer a new and improved cooking experience. They argue that there will be a 40% reduction of fuel expenses. This, however, is claimed under quite controlled circumstances. And in the end, you see that a lot of households use more pellets than is strictly necessary, and that these reductions in the end turn out not to be so significant as the company claims. Cooking on the pellets is a lot cleaner, not only for your hands to not handle charcoal, but also in terms of emissions and everything. It's quite quick. You can boil water in 7 minutes, whereas with the charcoal and bola, it takes a lot longer for the charcoal to ignite and everything like that. And the Philips stove is very durable. It can last up to 10 years, whereas in bola lasts maybe between 6 months, 6 and 12 months. In their marketing strategy, and I witnessed them going around and trying to sell the stove several times, they stressed primarily the environmental and health benefits of the stove. And the reduction in costs was something that usually only came in as a kind of secondary concern among the Emerging Cooking Solution salespeople. So this is kind of a summary of what they claim to be doing. Africa's new cooking fuel is here, cheaper, cleaner, healthier, faster than charcoal, 100% renewable. And their impact statement is that we save forests and reduce CO2 emissions, improve people's health, and strengthen household economies through business. So again, this sounds really nice, and I think we find a lot of ideal elements of frugal innovation and how it should be. But then in the end it turned out not that they couldn't just overrun the market and that people wouldn't just be running after them to be buying pellets and stoves. They decided to shift from Kitwe to Lusaka in 2014. Lusaka is the capital city of Zambia, because charcoal prices in Lusaka are higher and also because you have a slightly larger market there, also more sometimes higher income residents. And they adopted an alternative strategy in Lusaka. They started doing payroll deduction and targeting middle income consumers. So maybe teachers or clinicians or something like that. They would go to a large company and enlist maybe 20 or 30 employees at once, and over a period of 3 months deduct sums from their payroll to pay for the stoves. And this is actually quite a successful strategy, because a lot of people are enlisting to buy the stoves, but even those people who buy the stoves don't continue to use them continuously, because the stoves are usually only used then as a backup option. Teachers might have electricity already, so they will only use the stove when electricity goes out, and it will be kind of lying idle most of the rest of the time. And now Emerging Cooking Solutions is considering whether they should adopt subsidies for low-income customers. They have something called Give Cooking, where you can buy one stove here in the Netherlands and Europe, and then it donates one stove to a Zambian household. And also what they find really successful is the institutional stoves. So maybe selling stoves to large restaurants or orphanages, things like that, where people cook for a large part of the day. And the fuel reductions in this case are more pronounced than if you use it as a household user, because people get trained in how to use the optimum amount of pellets, and fuel reductions are more pronounced. And whereas we saw that Emerging Cooking Solutions is kind of shifting its market focus, there's a new company coming in the market in Kitwe, and that's Home Energy. They're strictly seen a competitor to Emerging Cooking Solutions, but they have quite an alternative design, production, marketing, and business model. This is quite an interesting example, I think, because it's a Zimbabwean sawmill owner who's been living in Zambia for most of his life. So he owns a sawmill and has access to free sawdust, which lowers his costs even more, because Emerging Cooking Solutions buys the sawdust at a low price, but they still have to buy it off the large timber mill. And also this Zimbabwean sawmill owner has a kind of deal to let prisoners produce the stoves for him. And prisoners provide free labor. And or maybe for the technically trained people, these are the stoves that the prisoners are able to produce. They look a bit less flashy than the Philips stoves, and they're also less durable, because they will maybe last for about 12-ish months. And they make your pots a little bit black if you cook on them. But these stoves can be marketed for about 120 kwacha, which is a significant reduction to the Philips stove. And also the pellets are sold for a very low price, whereas Emerging Cooking Solutions sells 16 kg of pellets for 45 kwacha. Home Energy sells 13 kg of pellets for 13 kwacha. And they adopted the strategy of putting up a marketing container in Chamboli, just next to the charcoal market. So they're marketing from this container and doing demonstrations and having people come to the container. And also they're doing door-to-door marketing, just going around households and trying to sell the pellets. So now I think we get to the interesting part. I tried to do consumer research where I interview households about their cooking habits. And I have some experience in doing quite day-to-day interviews about cooking habits with people in rural areas and talking about what kind of foods they like to eat and how that evolved throughout history. So I envisaged going to households and talking to them at length about why they preferred maybe the improved cook stoves or the charcoal stoves. But this proved not really to be the case. If I asked people whether they liked the improved cook stoves or not, they would say, yes, they're great. They're clean, they're quick. Especially the Philips stove was called also an aspirational product, because people would be proud to own quite a good Philips stove, which was very shiny and nice. And if I asked them about their complaints of the Philips stoves, they wouldn't come up with very fundamental things. It wasn't that the stove wasn't functioning or anything like that, but they just weren't using them. They said maybe we'll use them in the rainy season when it becomes difficult to light your charcoal and when charcoal prices also rise. But right now, there were only a handful of people really using the sawdust pellets on a day-to-day basis. Of course, they did have minor issues why they weren't using the stoves. For one, it's difficult to refill the pellets. Once the pellets that you've put into the stove burn up, you have to remove the charred pellets before you put new ones in, because otherwise you'll get a lot of smoke and you don't want that. Also, the cooking with the improved stoves does require some practice, how to regulate the flame, how much pellets exactly to put in, things like that. And also people said that the stove was ideal for quick jobs. So if you had to boil some water quickly or had to cook small amounts of food, it would be good. But if you would be cooking beans, which takes quite a lot of time, then the stove would be less useful. And I tried to take them through the rationale of why it wouldn't be good to cook beans on the improved cook stove, but they said, yeah, no, charcoal is just better for beans. One reason why they don't adopt it, probably, is also that the upfront costs are high. The stove is expensive, and the pellets sometimes can also be expensive because they're only sold in large bags, whereas you can buy charcoal just to cook one meal. But that argument also doesn't hold completely if we remember the people who I interviewed in St. Anthony's who did buy the stove. And these are low-income households for whom 250 kwacha, which is just over probably 30 euros, is a lot of money. So they did invest in buying the stove, but then now they're not buying the pellets anymore. I think the reduction in fuel expenditure is not always evident. The payback time might be quite long, and also if people really use it, they don't find the 40% reduction in fuel prices. So in all, what we find is that Mbaula and Malasha remain quite dominant. And the major thing that I think contributes to this is the broader economy of charcoal. People say that they're very used to charcoal. They've been using it at least since the 1930s. And charcoal burning and trade generate a lot of livelihoods for a lot of people. They might not contribute that much money to one individual, but all in all, the trade, the burning, transport, reselling, contribute to the livelihoods of a lot of individuals. Charcoal fines contribute to income for the Zambian state because it's kind of strictly illegal, but then the roadblocks are there, and if you do encounter them, you have to pay a fine. But all in all, charcoal actually has this highly efficient value chain and distribution and sales system, which actually SMV, a Dutch development agency, is trying to copy. So SMV is trying to set up an alternative, kind of more charcoal briquetting and the production of these stoves on a local basis, but they're trying to copy the value chain of charcoal to market their alternative. And also charcoal feeds into the rural-urban link. And I think this is an important factor because most of the people living in Kitwe today might have been born in rural areas, and labor migration is still a very significant factor in Zambian society. And charcoal links the rural to the urban areas and makes this link enduring because charcoal is produced in rural areas and generates income for largely agricultural households, whilst selling it mainly in urban areas. So these are a couple of pictures of charcoal. To conclude, I think sawdust pellets and improved cook stoves are examples of frugal innovation, and because they save costs and they're polycentric, and the business models that people adopt to market them are quite innovative in my view. But they haven't been adopted on a massive scale yet. They have taken off, the companies have been established, but they're not finding the sales figures that they expected. I think the strictly economic rationale is quite complex. Even households make complex decisions. It's not just about purchase costs, but also the fact that charcoal, although it might be strictly more expensive, generates livelihoods over a longer period of time, if you take that into account. And I think this example tries to illustrate also that frugal innovations can be really complex also to understand, that you can't just look at the maybe purely technical or purely economic rationale, but that you have to take other more elusive factors into account, which I probably haven't covered fully, but at least in parts, I hope I've started to address them. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Iva, for this presentation, which indeed shows that complexity and also very unexpected things sometimes pop up when you look more closely to these frugal innovations just at the ground. But I would like to, to come up with a couple of questions. Yes, yes.
Yeah, my name is Kofi Makiwa from Delft University. Just a quick question. Did they try and sell smaller amounts of pellets?
Yes, but it's just that the official packaging, especially for emerging cooking solutions, they wanted to just sell the 16 kg, but now a market woman has started selling 3 kgs.
Exactly, yeah, because that's what works in Africa. People don't want to buy a huge sack, they want to buy small, even if it's more expensive.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I saw you in the back.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. One aspect I think which is very interesting is that in Frugal Innovation many times there is a focus on the technical aspect of the innovation, and at the end of the user demand, and many times we don't think about this intermediate aspect of supply chain distribution, and in the idea of inclusivity, the trading networks which are in the intermediate space between technical innovation and use. So in this case, it's a very good example of what many times is missing in our way of thinking about frugal innovation. So my question was about did the entrepreneurship, because you present someone who was an entrepreneurship, why don't he thought about involving charcoal, you say, distributor in his business? And was it possible?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And indeed, the distribution raises another, just one small point, because now that Emerging Cooking Solutions has mainly shifted its enterprises to Lusaka, but they're still producing in Kitwe. And this is a 400-kilometer stretch of road, which drives up the costs of the pellets significantly. And I think Home Energy did think of linking to charcoal traders, and that's why they chose as a location for their container in Chamboli, the location next to the charcoal market. So they directly wanted this competition to kind of get charcoal traders to start selling their pellets. But I think right now it's just seen as too much of a competition. And also the fact that the pellets are just produced in one spot because you don't have these sawdust mountains in other parts. Thanks.
No, sorry with my keys. Natasha Wagner, ISS. Actually, when I was listening to your presentation, I got also very much intrigued by the economic conditions and everything. But then at some point, I started thinking about the behavioral aspects. And I'm wondering whether this is actually the explanation. Because, I mean, you said that, people said that, cooking for a large family, this cook stove might just not be it. I mean, it looks small. So, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm just thinking, if you're used to cooking in large, with large pots, and then you get this tiny little cook stove, and also like the whole tradition of cooking, the routines and processes around cooking, like, is that important in Zambia? Like, how does a woman feel who is used to cook, for 7 hours a day? I don't know. Yeah? And now all of a sudden she has to do the quick cooking. I mean, could that play into it? Because I think very often we have smart ideas, innovative ideas, but when I just look at my friends, who come to visit and are supposed to use the OV chip card, some of them, they're like, oh, I'd rather use my car, even if it takes ages, but this OV chip card business, that's weird. I'm not used to it. I mean, for us, it's, it's so simple, so easy. So, I mean, just saying, could that be part of the puzzle? Or?
No, of course, thank you. That is a large part of the puzzle, but that's also, I guess, the more difficult thing to grasp. Cooking in large amounts is possible on the stove, and especially the institutional stove, which is huge, and which you can cook for 100 people, it'll do. But I think if we're talking about behavior, it's interesting to compare the Philips stove to the stove produced by the prisoners. Because if you give households the choice of the Philips stove, they'll see it as an aspirational product, and they won't want the prime stove, which is cheaper. But in Chamboli, where the stoves that are produced by the prisoners are marketed, people will go for the cheapest stove. So also kind of consumer preference doesn't always go in the same directions, because the Philips stove, which is nice and durable, will be an aspirational object in itself, whereas if you give them cheaper options, maybe they will in Kamfinsa increasingly go for the cheaper things, but not always.
Thank you very much. I am from Delft University of Technology. The cook stove you showed is designed by my student.
Which one? By the prisoners? Or?
Her name is one nice-looking Philips stove. Actually, in your graduation projects, we work with businesses, and Philips asked us to design a cook stove. But the target group was not Africa, but target group was India, number one. Number two, the fuel was not pellets, but fuel was the collected pieces of wood, pieces from the tree falling down. Kids go and collect the wood, and then the main objective was to reduce the indoor pollution.
Yes.
Because in India, a lot of women even die because of indoor pollution. It was introduced in India. It was not as successful for many other reasons. And then it was translated to Africa, transferred to Africa. And there it started to manufacture, and they started introducing in Africa. But what I do not know, at least I know in India, it has been not designed for pellets. So it's quite possible that the users in Zambia, they have discovered that it is possible to use the cook stove without pellets. because it's not designed for pellets. So users are extremely clever. I can give one more example, like for instance in China, when we tried to introduce washing machines for Chinese people, then we discovered that the washing machine was getting clotted. And the reason was the Chinese were not only washing clothes, but they were also washing vegetables. So users are very clever.
Yes.
So it's quite possible that Zambian users have discovered that it is possible to, perhaps that's the reason why I think you can sell the stoves, but not sell the pellets.
Okay, thank you for this bit of...
A new puzzle, maybe.
No, thank you very much about the prehistory of the stove. That's useful to know. I think the stove has been slightly adapted to be useful for burning pellets.
I'm not sure whether that question is extremely important. Cooking habits of Zambian are not the same thing as cooking habits of Indians. So the size, for instance, the same cooking stove, we tried to sell it in China, but it was not a success. The reason was Indians cook by sitting and Chinese cook by standing. So it has to be redesigned to make it for standing women. So the design has to be adapted to the context.
Yes. No, of course. Thank you. But I don't think, as of yet, they've found this clever other use for the stove, because the ones I saw were really dusty and just somewhere in a corner. So I don't know, they would have to be really ingenious to trick me that they're not using the stove. And okay.
Don't underestimate the users.
Thank you.
Yeah, it reminds me, I'm a bit older than you are, so I remember these older things, but of intermediate technology in the late 70s, early 80s. And I remember the experiments of an intermediate technology center in Zimbabwe, where I was living then, that they tried to introduce these solar cookers. Didn't work because of these cooking practices that you need to start preparing meals many hours earlier than you would have with the charcoal. And I'm still puzzled by this question. Is it the cooking practices issue, or is it the economy of affection that says that we would prefer to continue with charcoal because we have relationships with the trader, or there is a relative that is actually producing the charcoal in the countryside? Maybe that's something that you could investigate by asking about the linkages that households have with these people that are in the charcoal chain, and to what extent there is also this variation in the use of the new device, and to what extent that is related to age or other sort of characteristics of the users. Anyway, that's just a suggestion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think in Zambia in the 80s there was also this project with ceramic-lined cook stoves by the University of Zambia, actually, and something like the National Institute for Scientific Research. But it didn't work mainly because the stove was too heavy, so it couldn't be carried from one place to the other, and all these kinds of user difficulties. But then the second point you raised on the economy of affection, I thought, well, I know the whole history of labor migration in Zambia. It would be pretty cool if you could find that the charcoal traders also have like a fair distribution among various localities in Zambia or something like that, but that isn't the case. It's not directly that people buy charcoal from their relatives. The link is not that direct. But yeah, thanks for the tip. And thank you.
So I have two questions. One is very, very similar to the economy of affection question, and that's like you kind of list that as the economy of charcoal as being a big barrier. So I wondered, and you said it's not a direct link of people buying from their relatives. So I'm wondering, what is the link? Is it about sort of people within the charcoal business putting pressure on people and you know, kind of making them feel like they have solidarity or anything like that? Like, why is that holding it back? And also you mentioned about the fines being an income for the state. So are there state agents also kind of doing the opposite of marketing. And then my second question was about the prison labor. And I just wondered how he had access to this prison labor and what was his position that allowed him to do that.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks. About the prison labor, I don't know exactly, but I asked him and then he said, well, prisoners are supposed to provide a bit of labor and to pay for their own upkeep, and they get involved in all these kinds of projects, and apparently this Zimbabwean guy was quite influential and managed to make them produce stoves instead of I don't know exactly. And then I think the economic link of charcoal comes more through livelihood generation, even in urban areas. A lot of market women just selling charcoal and earning small profits, but significant profits. And I think if those women would no longer trade charcoal, their livelihood would become much more difficult. So I don't think it's a direct, like, real economic link, but it's more, yeah, more subtle somehow. Yeah, I don't know exactly how I would call it, but I think it is a significant factor, not in strict monetary terms only, but also for these broader ramifications. And the fines by the states, some traders do get by without getting fined at all, and then now they want to levy taxes on the pellets as well. So the pellets could be an income for the government. And whereas the Swedish entrepreneurs are paying the taxes, the Zimbabwean entrepreneur says he won't pay the taxes because he just feels too confident of himself. He says he won't pay, even if they make him pay, because it's his sawmill and he can apparently for now do whatever he wants.
Okay, okay, thank you.
One sentence question in relation.
Yes.
You put it there as an innovative business model, but let's say using prison labor and not paying taxes doesn't sound like a very innovative business model. Or
well, maybe not positive innovation, but it's ingenious at least. Maybe I should put ingenious.
yeah, well, we
Indigenous.
have to be careful about the
Yes.
words that we use.
Okay, there's, before the tea break, we have room for two questions. Ria first, and then Nicholas at the end, and then the rest can be done bilaterally.
Thank you. I, of course, felt triggered when you let the word anthropology land in relation to behavior, but this is a very intriguing question, which is very similar to the question why people do not take other health decisions, whereas it's very clear that the results are negative. And part of the problem in my field of medical anthropology is that we often work with the wrong models of how people, what they base their behavior on. So the very dominant rational choice theories about what a subject is, and the little knowledge we have about routine behavior and what is driving routine behavior. So I was thinking that if I would look for models of that look at people's behavior from a different perspective, because to change a routine behavior costs energy, and it may be that just a little choice costs you too much in the context that you already have to make, and we know that, for instance, neurobiologically, it really is a cost of energy when you change your behavior. And it's much more than simply saying, now I'm going to do this. You have to change a lot of things. You have to build different patterns in your brain. So I'm just saying that it may be in more in that area than in anything else. So it can be that it's not some culture is always the solution where we find obstacles, then it's culture. But it may also be something else which is much more universally human. That's actually what I was.
Okay.
Thank
Short
you.
reaction, maybe?
No,
or?
I'll take
Okay.
that into account.
Okay, thank you. And then going to the last question. Please say your name. How you doing?
Hi, my name is Nicolas Chevrolier and I work for the BOP Innovation Center. I'm not that old, but I tried a few years back to sell solar cookers in Madagascar. I'm back in the Netherlands now, so I was not that successful, I guess. But I've learned a lot from this and what we do at the center now. And we look at several companies that try to sell solar cookers or cook stove. And what we find out is that most of the time the issue is the before last sentence that you have on the slide. Behavior change, marketing and distribution. Mm-hmm. And the assumptions that entrepreneurs make is that the market is there, I come with a good idea and the market will absorb it. Well, the market is not there, you have to create it. So it means behavior change, marketing, distribution. So what I was curious is that when they sell the cook stove, what was the marketing messages that they give? What was the key aspirations for them to buy this? So I was a bit curious to hear that. Because in a way, if somebody comes and tell me you can buy a new kitchen because it can save the forest, I might not be willing to buy. So I was a bit triggered. What's really the aspiration they were selling there?
Yeah, well, that's what I found striking, is that on their website, and I think that point is here, cheaper comes first. But when they're marketing in a group and trying to make people enlist for payroll deduction, they'll stress, oh no, you're buying a product that will help stop deforestation, or that will be healthier for you because you won't inhale CO2 anymore, and things like that. And cost would only come as a kind of second thing.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and for answering the questions and taking into account the comments. And now we have a tea break till 4 o'clock. Yes.